Hi everyone. In this presentation, I will discuss aspects associated with distribution management within Link's supply chain management simulation game. In Links, you have three distribution options in each region. Option 0 would mean that you have no DC in region 2 and region 3, and you would ship directly from your plant and its co-located distribution center DC1. Option 1 would imply that you have a subcontract DC service from a third-party vendor. And option 2 means you own and operate your own distribution center. So you could choose to have any of these options in any given region, especially region 2 and region 3. Now, some of the factors to consider while deciding on the distribution alternative is that if you wish to have postponed production, you will need option 2. You ought to own and operate your own DC to execute postponed production. So you have to consider what the costs of postponed productions would be and what are the benefit that you would get if you would engage in postponed production. In case you do not want to have postponed production as an option, then what you have to consider are aspects associated with cost of transporting these products directly from region 1 to region 2 and region 3. We will see some of the examples which will illustrate this point a little bit more in detail. So let's look at, first of all, getting a basic understanding on the different costs associated with option 0, 1 and 2. And the idea is to bring up some of the points that have been discussed in Link's manual in the form of some problems. So problem 1 here is to select which of the following cost areas differ between distribution option 0, which is no DC, option 1, which is a third-party DC, and option 2, which is owned DC in any region. First is product cost. Does it vary depending on the option? It doesn't, because product cost is directly dependent on the raw materials, subassembly components, the warranty level, the bandwidth that you have chosen for the product. So it doesn't matter which option of distribution you have considered. Transportation costs would change depending on the options that you have chosen, because if you have a distribution center in a given region, let's say in region 2, then you are shipping the products first from distribution 1 to distribution 2, and then from distribution center 1 to distribution center 2, and then you're doing the customer shipments from distribution center 2 in that region. But in case you don't have the distribution center in region 2, then you will have to directly ship the products to the customers from DC1. So it will change transportation costs in non-trivial way. So we would say this is one of the costs that will be impacted. Next is administrative overhead. Now in Links, administrative overhead is related to forecasting inaccuracies. So forecasting inaccuracies do not change because of the options of distribution that you have chosen. That would not be one of the costs that differ based on the distribution options. Next, fixed costs to open, operate and close distribution centers. This would change because depending on whether you own one or you are outsourcing one of the distribution centers, you would have different cost structures to manage. So we would say this is another one which would be impacted. And then finally, inventory carrying cost. This also changes depending upon whether you have your own distribution center, your outsourcing distribution center, or whether you do not have any distribution center. We will see some examples to get a better understanding of this. For now, let's consider that as the third cost component. Now moving forward, Let's assume that your firm currently has distribution option 1, which is third-party DC, in region 2. And you are considering switching to option 2, which is to own a DC, because the operating cost is much cheaper. So let's look at some cost factors associated with this switch. So your firm currently pays $50,000 per round. So from manual you can see this information, but as of now you're paying $50,000 as your operating cost. But when you switch from a third-party DC to an own DC, it changes your operating cost to $25,000. So how much would you save, if anything, each simulation round in operating costs if you switch from option 1 to option 2? The answer would be 50,000 minus 25,000. So that's what you have here, which is $25,000 saving per round. So if you have 6 rounds of simulation run, you can multiply that with 25,000. How much would you save, if anything, if in inventory holding costs, if you switch from option 1 to option 2? Now inventory carrying costs also change as you move from the third-party DC to owned DC. In a third-party DC, you pay 5% inventory carrying cost. In owned DC, you pay 3%. You incur 3% as your inventory holding cost, so the saving would be 2%. That is the saving in inventory holding cost every simulation round. Okay. Next, assume that you carried $500,000 of finished goods inventory at DC2, which is a third-party DC at this time, at the end of the last simulation round. Calculate how much you spent in inventory charges at DC2 during the last simulation round. Now this kind of calculation is useful to understand the rationale behind switching one way or the other. So in this case, the amount that you spent on inventory carrying cost would be 5% of that total inventory value that has been given in the given problem. So that's going to be 5% of 500,000, which turn out to be $25,000. Now, if you were to see what would be the saving in inventory holding costs as we move from option 2, or rather option 1 to option 2, then what we can do here is the saving of 2% can be computed, and that would be something that we will save. So 2% of 500,000, because we are moving from 5% to 3% inventory holding cost, which would be a $10,000 saving in the given round. Right. Next, you will incur some one-time fixed costs to switch from option 1 to option 2. So let's look at how much is that fixed cost going to be, and then try to combine the fixed cost and operating cost to understand the net gain or net loss. The cost to close the current DC in region 2, there's a cost associated with closing this third-party DC and then starting this owned DC, and that cost is $50,000. All this information that I'm noting down here is from Link's manual, but it's just been presented in a problem format for easy understanding. Okay, so that's the cost to close the current DC. Then once you have closed, you open the new one. So the cost to open your own DC in region 2, that is $250,000, again from the manual. So in total, you incur $50,000 plus $250,000, which is $300,000 for opening a new DC. Now, assuming the inventory charge savings you calculated in the previous problem and the operating cost savings that you calculated also again in the previous problem, how many simulation rounds would it take to recover the one-time fixed cost? That is 300,000. So to get that, we can look at how much we currently have to incur for fixed cost, 300,000, and then divide this by inventory cost savings per simulation round. Now remember that we have calculated the inventory charge savings as 25,000 and then $10,000 as our operating cost savings. So the total will be $35,000 savings per simulation round. It's per round. So if we divide the two, we will obtain the total number of rounds that are required, and that is going to be equal to approximately 8.6 rounds. So if you have 8.6 more rounds in front of you, then this kind of a switch will have a positive impact on the overall cost. Now let's look at a problem a little bit more in detail to understand the overall cost associated with moving from one option of distribution to the other option. Now assume that your firm ships finished goods from your plant/DC in region 1 to customers in region 2. You own your own DC in region 1, but you don't have DC in region 2. So you expect the following results for region 2 during the next simulation round. 1, you would expect total sales in channel 1 for product 1 to be 5,000 units. Total sales in channel 2 for product 1 to be 6,000 units. Total sales in channel 1 for product 2 as 4,500, and total sales in channel 2 for product 2 as 5,500. Product 1 costs you $157 and product 2 unit cost is $200. A 5% safety stock is inventoried for each product. That's the policy that this company has established for themselves. From Link's manual, we can also note down some of these transportation costs. These have been provided to you as a part of this problem. That is to assume air transportation from plant to DC2, which is $8 in case we open up a DC2. Okay, so right now they don't have DC, but we are trying to explore multiple options. In case we intend to open up a DC, then this would be the cost of air transportation, and that is what we're going to assume. Per unit cost for customer shipment in channel 1 will be $18 directly from plant. So if you don't want to have a DC in region 2, then you will have to directly ship to the customers from DC 1 to the respective channels, channel 1 and channel 2. So it's going to be $18 for channel 1. Within region, surface transportation cost is $6 for channel 1 and $12 for channel 2. And assume that the firm carries inventory levels for products 1 and 2 that is equivalent to 5% of expected sales. Okay, so here I think there need to be one more information which right now seems to be missing, and that is the customer shipment in channel 2 will be $28. 28, which is directly from plant. So you have to consider these costs in case you don't want to have a DC in region 2. Right. Inventory holding costs from manual, 3% of the inventory value if you own a DC and 5% if it's a third-party DC. Now with this information, we need to calculate a few things. We will see this as an exercise to understand the total expected cost by choosing one distribution option versus the other. Now before we can proceed to that calculation, we will need to do some preliminary calculations. So first thing we will have to do is to look at the total production order that we will be having based on what we expect to sell. So let's say we have to undertake some preliminary calculations. Okay, so preliminary calculation, the first one is the total sales that we expect for product 1 is going to be 5,000 plus 6,000, so 11,000 units. We have to make these many units, and then on top of it we want to maintain 5% safety stock, so we add that in our production order, which will be 550 units. So in total we will need to make 11,550 units of product 1. For product 2 likewise, 4,500 plus 5,500, that means we need 10,000 units to be made plus the safety stock of 5%, which is 10,500. So these are the production orders for product 1 and product 2. So total production order should be 22,050. Just the sum of these two numbers. Next, we have to understand what are the channel sales. So we have to understand how much are we selling in channel 1 and how much are we selling in channel 2. So total channel 1 sales is going to be, sales is 5,000, which you have here, plus 4,500. So that is 9,500. Okay. And total channel 2 sales likewise is going to be 6,000 plus 5,500. 6,000 plus 5,500 gives you 11,500. So those are the sales quantities in the two channels. It's important to know this because that's what will have to be brought by transportation modes from the distribution center from where it's going to be originating. Now with this preliminary calculation, let's proceed to the next slide. Now in this slide we have three options: option 0, option 1 and option 2, and we will calculate the total expected cost by considering operating costs, transportation costs from DC to DC if there is a DC there, and transportation cost to customers depending upon whether the DC is available or not, and finally inventory holding cost will be added to the calculation. So operating cost per simulation round, right, I think there was one technical issue here, but let's proceed here. The operating cost per simulation round, if you don't have any DC, would be 0. But if you have a third-party DC and if you have an owned DC, there will be an operating cost, and we just saw the numbers. It's going to be $50,000 if it is a third-party DC, and it's going to be $25,000 if it is owned DC. So we note those numbers here. For transportation cost from DC1 to DC2, we have option 0, 0, because there is no DC in region 2. There is no shipment to be made from DC1 to DC2, so it's going to be 0. But if we are having a DC, irrespective of whether it's third party or own DC, we are going to use air transportation, and we are going to ship the product from DC1 to DC2 at $8 per unit. Now that $8 per unit will be incurred on the entire production order which is meant for this region, which is 22,050. So this gives you 176,400. Okay, so same way you will get the same number here. There's no difference between option 1 and option 2 because you still are shipping it to that DC. So the cost is going to be the same, which is 176,400. Now transportation to customers. Now here we have to segregate the customers based on channel 1 and channel 2. For channel 1, if you are using option 0, we have $18 cost, and the total sales that we are making in this channel is 9,500 units, which will give you a total cost of 171,000. For channel 2, it's $28. So that multiplied by the total sales that you expect, 11,500 in channel 2, which is equal to 322,000. So those are the costs associated with transportation to customers if you don't have a DC in region 2. Now if you have a third-party DC, then the costs are going to be somewhat lower. For channel 1, you will only incur $6. This is again from the information that we had in the previous slide, times the total sales, 9,500, which is equal to 57,000. And for channel 2, it's going to be $12 multiplied by 11,500. So it's going from DC2 to each of these customers in that region. That's equal to $138,000. Now, as in the case of transportation cost from DC1 to DC2, when we look at transportation to customers, these numbers are going to be identical for our option 2 as well, because it doesn't matter if it's third party or own DC, we are still shipping these products from the DC to customers. So channel 1 will still be 57,000 because of the same calculations that we did for option 1, and channel 2 will be 138,000. Now coming to inventory holding costs, we will have to consider product 1 and product 2 separately, because inventory holding costs are a function of the product cost, and these products have different costs. So for product 1, the cost of the product is $157, and the inventory holding cost, when you don't have any DC, you're going to be looking at 5% of 11,000, which is to be then multiplied by the inventory holding cost at your own DC in region 1, which is 3%. Okay, so this 5% that you have in the beginning is what you expect the remaining inventories to be at the end of that particular round. You're expecting 5% of your inventories to remain in the distribution center after sales. That is something which you have tried to plan accordingly. And the 3% is your inventory holding cost when it's your own DC. Now, even though you don't have any DC in region 2, you still have to ship the product from DC1 to DC2, so you're carrying all that inventories which will be sold in region 2 in your DC1. So you're incurring this holding cost at DC1, and this is equal to $2,590.50. For product 2, the only difference now is going to be, first, there are two differences. One is the cost of the product, which is $200, and then how much we actually will be carrying, which is 5% of 10,000, right? And then 3% as our inventory holding cost. So that gives you the total cost as $3,000. Now, the cost that we just calculated for option 0 with no DC is going to be identical to the cost that you would see in option 2 when you own your DC, because in both of those cases your holding cost of 3% will be what you will incur. The only difference that you will see is in option 1, because in option 1 you have to incur 5% as compared to 3%. So in option 2 you would still incur 3%. You would have the same calculation as we did just now. The only difference is this 3% is on the DC that you own in region 2, which is DC 2. So we can write here for product 1 it is the same 2590.50, and for product 2 it is 3000. Okay. Now for option 1, the calculation will require us to consider the 5% inventory holding cost as compared to the 3%. So for product 1 it's going to be $157 times the 5% that we have used earlier for how much we intend to keep as our inventories in the end of that round, and then multiplying this with 0.05 as against 0.03, and this is equal to 4,317.5. For product 2 we will calculate using $200 times 0.05 multiplied by 10,000, and then again multiplying it by the 5% inventory holding cost, and this gives you $5,000. So now you have calculated different cost components, and when you add all these different cost components, the total expected cost will turn out to be, for option 1 or option 0, it's going to be 498,590.50. For option 1, this total expected cost is $430,000, 717.50, and for option 2 it is 401,990.50. So we have now calculated the total expected cost, and looking at the total expected cost we can make the decision that we should go for option 2, given that it has the lowest cost among the 3 options. And that's kind of calculation that you should be doing when you begin your link simulation. In fact, in the beginning you will be required to decide your supply chain design, and such calculations could be useful to understand what you should be doing with your supply chain design. So that's where I end my discussion on distribution alternatives and distribution management issues. Thank you for listening.